Hello. The oil market, which has demonstrated volatile dynamics since the beginning of the year, consolidated near the levels of $75 to $70 per barrel for WTA marker grades in anticipation of additional drivers of movement. Our conversation today with the former head of the international price agency, Argus, the author of the Telegram channel Global Energy Markets, Vyacheslav Mishchenko, is about the market prospects and the factors influencing it. I would like to begin our conversation by stating the following fact. The world's leading analytical bodies differ in their assessments of the development of the oil market in 2025. OPEC predicts a deficit balance, excess demand over supply in the region of 1 million barrels per day, and a link to the development of petrochemicals and air transport. The International Energy Agency, by contrast, predicts a supply surplus of around 500,000 barrels per day, citing accelerated green energy development and, most importantly, expanded production by non-member countries. How can one explain this difference in assessments, and whose arguments seem more compelling? The question is very correct, and the answer to it is very simple. There is no need to analyze the situation for long. Each player plays for his own team. OPEC, in fact, is an organization that was created to advance the interests of oil producers and exporters. Advocates promoting the idea of a supply deficit, thereby pulling the blanket over itself and showing economic and various analytical bodies that there will be less oil, so hurry up to buy it at normal prices, otherwise everything will rise. The IEA, as an international energy agency, was created as a counterweight, as an antipode to OPEC in the 1970s. All this confrontation, crises and so on in the Middle East. The IEA speaks on behalf of consumers. The key consumers are mainly European economies, developed countries of the OECD, and so on, for whom it is profitable to buy resources cheaper. Therefore, it is advantageous for them to position the situation with the supply-demand balance in their favor, and to say that in principle, there will be a lot of oil. Therefore, there is no need to scare us. We know everything ourselves. That is why this is the whole nature of these relationships between these two. Well, one can say powerful organizations which, one can say shake the market in one direction or another, giving financial speculators the opportunity to make money. But in this regard, perhaps we should somehow evaluate the current situation. Is it still close to equilibrium, if we talk about supply and demand, or is there some rather strong deviation in one direction or another? You know, I wouldn't trust all of this at all now, because basically all of these forecasts, yes, they are based on certain methods and so on, but they are opportunistic. That is, the forecast is always favorable to one side or the other when it is necessary to move the market somewhere or stimulate demand. Let me remind you that OPEC is not working alone now, but there is also the OPEC Plus platform, which includes, in particular, the Russian Federation, and we represent the largest producer of the Plus format. From an OPEC perspective, the largest is probably Saudi Arabia. And here, of course, the main spoiler of the whole situation is the United States with its current leadership. The Donald Trump administration, let's face it, has changed all the rules of the game in the current month and the past month of its, so to speak, rule. Just look at the meeting in Riyadh, where, in essence, an active negotiation process between the United States and Russia has already begun. The dialogue that began concerned not only the conditional Ukrainian crisis, but it also concerned the situation on the energy markets, and Trump is a prominent representative of the American oil lobby. It is known that OPEC Plus is currently considering the issue of extending or terminating the voluntary restrictions introduced by previous decisions. According to estimates by analytical bodies and investment banks, The majority of OPEC Plus members are allegedly inclined to extend the previously effective restrictions. But as Bloomberg writes, a complicating factor is emerging in the form of what you said, in the form of the US administration, which insists on increasing production and is actively negotiating with the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia. In this connection, new introduction. Is it possible to find some kind of compromise solutions, exchanges, let's say, that would suit all three of these participants? Yes, well, the United States, which we are talking about now, yes, with the new leadership, they have always been the antithesis of the OPEC Plus platform, or rather, its opponents, yes. And Trump, I remind you, in his first iteration, when he was still in his first term, yes, of presidency, he called OPEC Plus monopolies was going to antitrust proceedings, antitrust, and so on. That is, for Americans, this is quite understandable terminology. Now he threatened a little, yes. That is, OPEC plus the platform was ordered by order to start pumping oil there and make concessions. Well, as I understand it, while all this was in the form of verbal interventions, then negotiations began between Russia and the United States. And accordingly, with the mediation of the prince, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, bin Salman. Therefore, here I do not rule out that certain agreements have already been reached, whether there will be OPEC Plus or not, to increase or to restrain and so on. This is all very opportunistic, yes. That is, everything will depend on the state of the market, on the state of demand, on the situation primarily with sanctions, yes, because all the sanctions that exist now, this is Venezuela, this is Iran, this is Russia, it certainly requires some kind of solution because the market has become segmented. The market is now heterogeneous. Yes, as we know, we call it there. There is a shadow fleet and so on. There are, accordingly, shadow deals with oil, yes. And to what extent they influence the overall balance now is sometimes very difficult to calculate, even for us, in our reality. Well, there are, accordingly, Western estimates, yes, that we produce there. Well, about 9 million barrels per day, plus or minus, yes. Accordingly, America now produces over 13. This is a historical record. And I do not rule out that with such pressure from Trump, which now gives the entire oil lobby the opportunity to sort of turn around, they could reach the level of 15 million barrels per day in the next 2 years. That is, they are the largest supplier of resources. What I want to say is that you and I have lived through this entire period, yes, post-Soviet, with some sense of the everything has been said, the Dutch disease and so on. Yes, we are, therefore, a resource country, a gas station there, a country, therefore, an oil rig, and so on. And at this time, the United States was constantly held up as an example to us, which supposedly was a high-tech economy, an internet economy, and now, well, all sorts of things, yes, these digital platforms and so on. However, in the United States, the last decades have seen a boom in resource extraction and export. This is the main source of income for the budget, the government budget of the United States. And the funniest thing is that they are not ashamed. On the contrary, they are actively promoting their position on the world market, that is, oil, gas, and food products. The Americans are already beginning to influence the European market, not only by the volume of supplies, but also by determining the price. Because the American conditional standard WTI is now being actively introduced into the North Sea. That is, the volumes of American oil that come to the European market have practically already exceeded all the volumes of oil produced in the North Sea. And the so-called conditional benchmark Brent, which consists of 6 grades of oil, including Norwegian and British grades, is essentially now in relation to American oil because it prevails, including in terms of volume, and from the point of view of setting the price for the European benchmark. It is, in fact, we can say that today Europeans are actually switching over, replacing Russian varieties and partly Arab varieties with American oil. The market for raw materials in general, especially the oil market, is heterogeneous. We can't say that we took away here and added there. All this happens in a much more variegated picture. Let's say there is such a thing as a technical benchmark. The Mediterranean market, the southern market, where the Russian Urals grade was also actively supplied, that is, our Black Sea ports and so on, Kazakh oil came. For a long time, I used Urals as a technical benchmark. That is, when for various reasons URLs began to go less to the southern direction, then the oil refiners of this cluster, that is, this region of the Mediterranean Sea, they were focusing on the buzz. The quality of the URLs was created by such a bouquet of oils that they purchased from Africa, the Middle East, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and so on, which they brought to the state of the technical characteristics of the YURLs. That is, URLs, remaining a technical benchmark, was not physically present in this market, or was present only in some minimal quantities. Therefore, all these things are very characteristic of the oil market. Therefore, interpenetration, the purchase may be of a smaller volume, but which is better in quality and so on, which brings the quality of oil to the required state in order to obtain the output of oil products in one market or another. All this is present. And the Russian variety URLs and other varieties have not gone anywhere. European oil refineries, first and foremost, are still forced to consume, mix and process them. The only thing is that logistics has become more complicated. The so-called financial logistics have become more complicated in general, which makes it more expensive, essentially making the entire chain much more expensive. As is known, the price situation for Russian varieties has been deteriorating quite seriously since the beginning of the year. Euro's discount to Brent reached $15 on SFLOP basis in Indian ports. There are already forecasts for 17.5. If you look at Westerners and so on, it is clear that consumers to pressure Russian suppliers to increase the discount. In general, how do you think the country will be able to adapt to such a high level of discount? And in general, how quickly will it be possible to reverse this trend? But I will tell you that the figures that you announced at the beginning of this year are not a high discount. The discount was high at the end of 2022, at the beginning of 2023, when it essentially reached half the cost of oil from the benchmark, and 40 and 37 and so on. That is, the figures that we are now referring to are, in principle, normal. As for pricing in the oil market, it is quite complex. If we take the current structure, how it has all formed over the last 40 years, then there are, correctly as you said, certain standard varieties. We, in particular, are guided by how the main European country is productive. Severomorskie varieties are a brand. But, as I said earlier, in principle, American oil is now actively participating in pricing, including in the North Sea, because its volume is significant now. It is lighter, WTI. Here, this is the first one, that is regarding the discount. In fact, the price of oil itself is determined through a system of floating differentials. They are always swimming, always staggering somewhere. Sometimes it runs into the premium, sometimes, well, most often Russian oil is traded naturally at a discount. What does it depend on? The discount depends on a huge number of factors. The first is that it is market-based. This is the quality of oil. This is her market, actually. Well, the sale of the balance of just the proposal on a specific example, on specific oil. But still, the logistics chain certainly plays a role. There are financial difficulties, insurance, and so on. But the most important factor is the situational factor. This is when a situation arises at a given moment when you want to sell, but you can't, or someone wants to buy, but can't. And this differential starts to float, that is, to move somewhere. Yes, it's a very ephemeral thing. It changes every day, and it changes from deal to deal, yes. Those discount levels that are given by some international or domestic media, or even price agencies, they are very conditional. They are averaged, because you cannot give the entire range, that is, the entire motley picture of transactions, because they are very individual. Some of them, maybe no one even level at which they are sold. It's actually for sale, yeah. Therefore, here it seems to me, there is no need to worry from this point of view about some current moment in time that the deal is too high. That is, the discount is not necessary because tomorrow it will be low. Again, it all depends on the market structure and the deficit, but still, the geopolitical factor has a strong influence. That is, fundamental market factors and geopolitics influence. Geopolitics has, unfortunately, recently begun to play a major role in light of this huge number of sanctions and restrictions. In Western expert literature, the opinion about the possible collapse of OPEC is quite widespread. OPEC Plus platforms, for a variety of reasons. That is, it is considered as two grounds. This is simply a refusal to fulfill quotas due to the unwillingness to lose market share to independent producers who are not part of the alliance. And the second, as it were, scenario, it is being discussed very actively today. It is the possible exit from the alliance of one or another organization, which means that kind of fragmentation, it is called Kazakhstan. How great, in your opinion, are the risks of these radical scenarios? Because they can have extremely negative consequences for the Russian Federation, because they will be the first to be forced out. Russian oil first. Regarding Venezuela, not everything is so clear. Recently, there was information in Western professional platforms that Chevron had finally achieved certain concessions from the Trump administration. Why did this information appear? Why has a decision been made or a desire to revoke these exceptions been announced now? And about any sanctions prohibitions. Maybe it's a certain game, but I think Venezuela is too important right now for American refiners because Venezuelan crude is heavy and they need it, even in light of such a maturing conflict with Canada, when Trump also said a lot of things, including, so to speak, the accession of Canada as the 51st state. The main supplier of heavy oils is Canada to the US market. They supply 4 million barrels per day. So this is the first thing. As for Venezuela, I think the issue will be resolved. Perhaps there is some bargaining going on. The second point, regarding the OPEC Plus deal, is the overall stability of this platform. Let me remind you that this year the platform has existed for almost 9 years. And she proved herself. There was a zigzag. It was 2020, the onset of the COVID period. For a month, we remember what happened, what a rally there was. Yes, this dizzying price when the parties, primarily the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia, for some unknown reason did not come to an agreement, and the Saudis behaved quite emotionally. They announced that they were pulling out of this deal, and they flood the market with oil of their own production. Well, it turns out that they stepped on their own rake. That is, the oil market has remained, but at the same time, there are COVID restrictions, plus a breakneck growth in freight. Because they themselves, having lowered this price to the threshold value, it went into the minus. If you remember, just on the American futures market, they raised the fract rates because, in essence, all market participants went into oil storage. And tankers are also part of this big storage story. And so the market went into some kind of rally in terms of rising freight prices, and deliveries from Saudi Arabia became unprofitable. The Saudis have already burned their fingers in this situation. When we refuse this coordination, we will seize all the niches ourselves. I think they've learned their lesson. And here the key producers within this format, I said, are the Russian Federation and Saudi Arabia. As for Kazakhstan, you know, everything would be fine, except for one thing, logistics. That is, Kazakhstan, with such expectations of production growth, is still locked in very narrow bottlenecks. And first of all, this is, of course, KTK. There's also something wrong with KTK, because it's periodically like, well, is probably also a target now. Yes, for various kinds of physical attacks. We know that drones have also hit the stations, yes, and then there were some violations of the technological chain and so on. Therefore, KTK operates with difficulties, yes. Yes, there are alternative projects. That is, to launch about 20 million barrels, 20 million, probably, tons per year, in our terms, through the Azerbaijani route Baku-Tbilisi-Jahan. But it is logistically more complicated because Kazakhstan is located across the Caspian Sea from Azerbaijan. This means that either tankers or some systems, such as ferries, must be significantly increases the cost, lengthens the chain, and makes it quite questionable from the point of view of marginality and so on. Therefore, I think that it is unlikely that any country will be able to simply up and leave this format, given the experience that has already been accumulated. Let's talk about demand now. All previous of increased demand are linked to the growth of the Chinese and Indian economies. I believe that in 2024, these forecasts did not work out because there was accelerated electrification of transport, leading to a reduction in gasoline consumption by 1% and oil imports by 2%. Looking at the forecasts for the current year, how can this situation be commented on? In parallel with our conversation, the so-called Oil Energy Week is ending in the glorious capital of Great Britain, London. There were quite a few, I think, significant people speaking there. Yes, both at the conference itself and at various other venues, including the heads of the largest commodity traders. In particular, the head of Vitol, the largest commodity trader, just said, I think today or yesterday, that let's not rush with all these green things, with electric cars, with energy transitions and so on. Otherwise, we undermine the conditions for the development of the world economy. Since fossil fuels, fossil resources have not exhausted their significance, and we significantly increase the risks of economic crises and so on if we completely zero out investment in resource extraction now. Moreover, Vitol is not alone, and BIPI recently announced a revision of the energy transition program for green energy. Therefore, a certain rollback has begun. This is already visible. But in essence, the United States, as we have already said, under Trump's new term, will be engaged exclusively in extracting profit from fossil resources. Trump is not at all interested in the climate and all these climate agendas, green deals and so on. He has already said this directly and openly. Therefore, I think that from this side, no matter how much demand for cars and so on is destroyed, the energy intensity of various economies, including China and India, yes, it is still quite high. So, well, India is generally located at the peak of the oil refining development program. Yes, and their oil refining capacity is increasing, and accordingly demand will already be guaranteed by this. Because the growth of oil refining capacity in these countries is quite high, and we see its dynamics. It does not determine the dynamics of demand for the year. This is usually an investment for several decades. I would also like to ask a question about Europe. Still, based on the previous year, we see firstly stagnation of the economy and, accordingly, stagnation of oil demand. If we look at the current year, can we say that in European energy demand the slowdown in the development of the green agenda will really accelerate from the point of view of government decisions, and somewhere this will be reflected in overall consumption? It is the European Union, as a model for energy development and so on, that, in my opinion, has driven itself into a corner. At the end of 2019, in December 2019, the fundamental documents of the so-called Green Deal were adopted on the platforms of all the European Union. They are the ones who action to reach the zero mark and so on by 2050. Yes, it's all very heterogeneous, it's all unpredictable. The market, as I have already said, is energetically much more complex from the point of view of consumption, from the point of view of supplies. And we see that, of course, there is no Green Deal in the European Union. It cannot exist and develop in it. They limited themselves. When you live under a Green Deal and you have a timeline or specific timeframes for refusal and zeroing out, then you cannot build long-term relationships with other partners. Here, for example, is a striking example. the close visit in 1922 of the now departing Chancellor Scholz to Qatar. Qatar is the largest producer of gas in its liquefied form. He came to ask for a lot of gas. The Qataris said, yes, of course, we are ready. Sign a contract with us for 30 years. What Scholz said, well, I'm exaggerating, but in general, yes, that's how it was. I can't, because in 1950 we shouldn't have any gas left. Then the stockists said, well, then get in line, buy it after everyone else. If you have time, if you can still give the price. And Scholz left with nothing. That is, this Green Deal, of course, did a disservice. That is, the European leaders of the so-called European Union cannot now guarantee any long-term cooperation with suppliers of oil, gas, and other resources. It seems that recently the level of sanctions against the opponents of Western civilization, Iran and the Russian Federation, has reached some kind of extreme maximum. In addition to Russia, sanctions are being introduced against Iran. And it is interesting to note that the Trump administration's statements indicate an intention to reduce Iran's exports from the current level of 1.5 million to 100,000 barrels. That is, the reduction is very significant. In this regard, here is the question. Is there not a general feeling, is a certain excess with these sanctions that control over their implementation will simply be maximally formal? There will be a situation like what Iran had with the Biden administration when the entire array is reduced, but exports are growing in an almost progressive manner, so to speak. And I would like to note this point also, because the West cannot replace both at the same time. No matter what we say, but such volumes that are lost as a result of sanctions cannot be replaced at the same time. As far as Iran and the overall situation with restrictions is concerned, as I said at the beginning, I deeply believe that the market is essentially fragmented now. So what are sanctions? This is a limitation of ourselves in working in the market. That is, on the one hand, it seems that the seller has been restricted. Product. Well, let's say Russia, yes, or Venezuela, or Iran. But in fact, they limited themselves in their choice. Because you can't buy here, you can't buy here, you can't buy here officially, yes. And accordingly, it's a double-edged sword or knife. Yes. So then it turns out that you can't live without this oil or without this resource. And various exceptions begin. Somewhere they are given officially, somewhere they simply turn a blind eye, somewhere it is, in principle, an uncontrolled process. Because, as we have already said, there is a so-called shadow fleet. It's not shadow, just a different fleet. He doesn't insure himself in London, he doesn't use brokers, etc. Fractions, fract, and so on are not calculated there in dollars. Well, are not paid for by transactions, yes, transactions through dollar accounts. That's all. That is, the market works. That is, it works according to its own trajectory and logic. And the old, as I already said, global, conditionally global market works, well, Western in its own way. But as I already said, the spoiler is now the United States, represented by Trump, who is completely changing all the rules. These statements that relate to Minnesota, to Iran, in my opinion, as I already said, are an attempt at the first stage to scare, to establish some of your own rules of negotiations with a frightened partner who wants to avoid being punished, to negotiate more easily and to receive more favorable conditions. No one is able to influence, that is, reduce Iran's production and exports by 10 times. Given that there is an independent China, there is an independent India that listens but does what it needs. That's why here, I think, there have been no successes, so to speak, from the point of view of sanctions. The only thing that the sanctions have achieved is that they have accelerated the process of, well, essentially creating new specific mechanisms for trade and logistics chains. And accordingly, what I have been talking about for a long time, perhaps not only Russia, but also the countries of the same BRICS need to come out and create independent exchange, and accordingly, over-the-counter market float indicators, not denominated in US dollars. It is not for nothing that Trump, one of the first messages to this organization, which was heard there a week or maybe 2 weeks ago, was that if you just try to refuse the dollar, I will destroy you all. And then he said, BRICS is dead. As soon as I said that I would destroy everyone, there in view of the 100% tariff, and everywhere in the Western press it was said, BRICS is dead, BRICS is dead. This was the main, so to speak, Trump's main message to BRICS. But nevertheless, BRICS is alive, we know that. Brazil holds the presidency this year. The Russian Federation is actively helping to shape the agenda through its institutions, and I will also make every effort, as far as possible, to ensure that exchange trading and, accordingly, pricing issues are on the agenda of the discussion of the format of economic interaction between the countries of Great Britain. Thank you very much.